This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, Mr. Jason Gregory. He is an author, philosopher, and teacher specializing in Eastern and Western philosophy, comparative religion, psychology, cognitive science, metaphysics, and ancient cultures. He has studied literally all over the world, and he is the author of Fasting the Mind, Enlightenment Now. That's his book that's out now, and we'll be talking about that today. Jason, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be on, Dennis and Phil. It's an honor.
Well, first, welcome, Jason. I'm going to correct you, Dennis. Fasting the Mind and Enlightenment Now are two different books.
Okay. Oh, I see. Actually, let me correct it all because it's Fasting the Mind is the book out now. Enlightenment Now is another book, and The Science and Practice of Humility is a third book, all by Jason. And we will focus on Fasting the Mind, but happy to talk about the other two as well, and anything else for that matter, Jason. So, Phil, go ahead.
Jason, for the sake of listeners who are not familiar with your work, why don't you give us a little brief background about yourself, your own spiritual path, how you came to the work you do?
Yes, it's not a particularly, what would you say, glamorous journey. I was brought up like any ordinary kid in Australia. I come from a middle-class family. My family wasn't religious or anything or spiritual. They had no indoctrination. My mum and dad were just basically middle-class people, good, honest people. And so I really had no spiritual training as a child. It wasn't until when I left Australia, when I became an adult, that I went through a lot of spiritual training. And it was because of my wife. I met my wife in Australia at a job we were both working at. She's from South Korea. And she told me about, I knew about meditation and that, but she, introduced India and Southeast Asia and all of these other philosophies to me. And I just sort of ran with it. We left Australia and I haven't really looked back. I've studied a lot of Eastern traditions, anywhere from Vedanta, classical yoga, Taoism, Zen Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, and many other traditions here and there. But yeah, that was basically it. I was just traveling around the world, planting myself in particular places. Like, for example, I would live somewhere like Tiruvannamalai for 6 months to a year and be full on studying Advaita Vedanta, or I would be staying somewhere like Dharamsala in northern India and be studying Mahayana Buddhism. This has been my life for basically the last 10 years, and it's just what makes me feel alive, you could say. I've tried a lot of other things in my life, but once I found Eastern thought, and especially the deeper spiritual practices of Eastern thought, it's really changed my life in a positive manner. But it's also revealed a lot of things about myself that I've had to change over time, of course, as well.
Jason, I wanted to ask you along these lines. It's fascinating, all the different areas that you've studied, and you've not only studied them in books. You've gone to monasteries, you've gone to these countries, you've studied with people that would be considered masters in these philosophies and these practices. Was there one particular philosophy or practice that particularly resonated with you, that you followed up on, that you consider your practice, the philosophy you follow now, or have you taken a little bit from each and continue to sort of look at everything?
Yeah, it's a good question, Dennis. It's kind of twofold. I think I've taken a little bit from everything, but there was, first of all, I would say that I was deeply influenced by the teachings of Ramana Maharishi, first and foremost, and that's what attracted me to Advaita Vedanta. And I met teachers such as Muji, if you know him.
Yes. And we're going to be interviewing him in the new year.
Oh, excellent! Yeah, I spent time with Muji, and yeah, I suppose that was probably the first philosophy and teacher. Even though Ramana Maharishi is not alive no more, but I was deeply influenced by that, and also the teachings of, I would say, of Zen. I was influenced a lot by through teachers such as Daisetsu Suzuki, Alan Watts, Joseph Campbell. That's just from reading their books, but
Yes,
yeah,
you're too young to have known them.
of course. And yeah, you guys, maybe you
Yeah,
guys
you're
do.
right.
No, no, no.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, and also I would say those two philosophies especially, and from being around places like there is Zen Buddhism up in Dharamsala as well, even though that's mainly, I would say, Tibetan Buddhism, because of Lama living up there, but there's a lot of Zen up there as well, and I would say also somewhat Theravada Buddhism in Thailand, because I've lived so long in Thailand,
Mhm.
about 4 to 5 years.
Mm.
So I have been influenced by Vipassana and all of these practices from Theravada Buddhism as well, and certain teachers over there. Hard to say their name because they're Thai names, but yeah. But first and foremost, I would say Advaita Vedanta and Zen Buddhism.
Mhm.
So both non-dual teachings,
Yep.
and if you've spent time at Tiruvannamalai, you've immersed yourself in Ramana Maharshi. So, and I see on your upcoming tour, you'll also be going to Pondicherry. So you must also be familiar with Sri Aurobindo and his work.
Yep.
But I could tell from the influence that you have a lot in common with Dennis and me.
Mhm.
Although we are old enough to have remembered Alan Watts, if not meet him. And um, I was looking at your website and at some of the pages, including your blog, and the title of one of your recent posts intrigued me. So I want to, since you mentioned Zen, the title is "To Think of Zen."
My interest is exactly, Phil. We're in sync. Go ahead. Yeah.
What does it mean to think of Zen? I think I know what you mean, but tell us.
I guess it kind of means, well, to think of Zen, the phrase is used in Zen when
Mhm.
someone uses a spiritual practice to become too pious, too much of a goody two shoes, and where there's, they make their life where there's actually no room for error. And, I don't know about you guys, but I think with the spiritual practice that, there's still room for error, there's still room for
Right.
improvement in our lives. And, you know, actually there's a lot of beauty in that too. There's a lot of beauty in the ugliness of life. This is a particular Taoist teaching. We kind of try to shed the ugliness of life and the ugly side about ourselves, um, to try and make life what it really isn't. So to think of Zen ultimately means to shy away from being a goody two shoe, and not to be at odds with your own humanity. Essentially, not to be at odds with your own humanity. I think
Right.
a lot of spiritual people who are interested in spirituality, especially Eastern spirituality, they're at odds with their own humanity a lot of the time. They start this internal war with themselves because they have certain idiosyncrasies or certain things about themselves that they wrestle with. But it's about accepting them, and I think that once we accept them, we can start to work with them and care for ourselves a little bit more, and hopefully transform whatever those tendencies are that we have, and so forth and so on.
Mhm.
So to think
Is
of Zen is it's just kind of I guess the Zen masters used it as a kind of a clever way of bringing that sort of philosophy up.
It's well put, Jason. My experience is with people in different spiritual traditions, especially somebody from the West who recently learns a spiritual practice or is involved in following a spiritual teacher. Initially, they try to create this mood that, and I've probably done this myself, where there's this great equanimity, where maybe it's there's not as much equanimity as they think, and
Mm.
they kind of rise above it all, and until there are major life challenges. And one experience I had, and I'd like you to remark on this. I was struggling with this kind of perception in other people, and even seeing it myself, of this sort of
Mm.
creating this mood. And then when I started reading like the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana, I was taken by the main characters of those books, Arjuna, Ram. They were they expressed very clearly their emotions and their fears and their ecstasies and the full range of human experience, tears, it was all there. Whereas I was observing a lot of people that were trying to deny those feelings in their life. Is this something that's common throughout the world of spirituality from your experience?
Yeah, it definitely is, Dennis. And I think that, like you said, you have had those tendencies in the past, and likewise have I. I think everyone surely has gone through that, and some people have never realized that too. Like what you said, there can be some people who have a sense of that they're, I don't know, better than the world or better than even themselves. I don't know how to say that really, but we can have that tendency, and it is a prevailing temperament, especially when you go to places like India and even in Tiruvannamalai, as we mentioned. You will see people who suffer from this affliction where they do feel that they are above everything, and it can be hard to have just a heart-to-heart conversation with them, because they're constantly at odds with their own humanity, and they don't understand that the psychological aspect is still a part of the human experience that we need to embrace. And we can, you can suppress that psychological aspect if you want, but it's going to come back stronger, and the tendencies are going to be much more stronger if you're not working on the, like I mentioned in the book, on the samskara and the vasana level. The vasanas meaning the latent tendencies and habitual actions, and samskaras are those subliminal imprints that we all have from just from living in life, and can be from past lives as well. So if we're not going to look at that psychological aspect, then we're just going to develop this tendency of, okay, I'm in self-inquiry. But if someone pisses me off, then I'm going to let them know about it.
Right.
And that's how it really becomes, with a lot of people. And I think it's a big learning experience too. That, I like what you said, Dennis, that the full human experience. That's a great expression, because I think people have a tendency to eliminate that full human experience, the emotions, and then it really just becomes a really cold, rational spirituality where you're just monitoring your mind constantly all the time, and there's no room for joy, there's no room for happiness or heart-to-heart conversations. All of these things can happen, and I think people have a tendency, for example, they'll look at Ramana Maharishi, right, and they will say, well, he was always in self-inquiry and this and that. Yeah, well, that's all well and good, but if you look at a lot of footage of Ramana and a lot of pictures and that, there's a lot of time where he's conversing with people around the ashram and laughing and having fun and patting cows and dogs and all sorts of things. I bet you he was a very humorous man. That's humor is a big part of spirituality. I think a lot of people, that they miss that.
Yeah. And I think that's true of all the gurus I've come in contact with. They're much more human and real than some of the followers pretend to be. Jason, you're speaking to us from Brisbane, Australia. Dennis and I are in the U.S. I've written a book that chronicles how the Eastern teachings came to America, and I'm often asked, is it the same in other countries? Is it other parts of the world? And I think Australia may be one of those places where it's a similar sort of phenomenon of acceptance in certain circles of the teachings of the East. Is that so? And if you've taught anywhere other than Australia, I wonder what you can say about the current state of spirituality there as compared to other places.
Well, you're right, Phil. It's definitely the same as, I would say, Australia. I've taught in the US and the UK and other places in Europe before, and I feel it's the same. Like it's this growing awakening of people who have an attraction towards, I would say, especially Eastern spirituality. A lot of people are getting involved in Hatha Yoga, Vedanta, Taoism, Buddhism, all of these practices that I guess 50 years ago in the West what were like, foreign words in our vocabulary. So yeah, I feel it's the same. I guess so. I guess one thing in Australia, there is a tendency towards, I would say, some people have a tendency towards full-blown New Age thought,
Mm-hmm.
meaning like, so taking particular philosophies of the East and, changing them according to their own perspective, which, I don't have much against, but, I do feel that there's a lot of validity in following a tradition to its nth degree, so, a lot of teachers before us followed those paths for those reasons and achieved certain results because of that particular tradition, that particular framework was beneficial for people. So I think that there is a tendency towards, I don't know what it's like so much in America, but there is a tendency towards a lot of people to New Age thought and to, I guess, there can be a tendency when you look at New Age thought to misinterpret certain philosophies and to take them with a Western context. I talk about that in Fasting the Mind, as you know, where I talk about the differences in the cognitive style between the East and the West, and I don't think it's anyone's fault in the West, but we have a tendency because of the evolution of cognition to think about things analytically, as opposed to holistically, which was the foundational cognitive style in the East. It's not to say that one or the other is better. We both need both the analytical mind and the holistic mind, but when we look at the philosophies of the West, they were built on holistic thinking. They were built on the idea of inclusiveness as opposed to exclusiveness, which we have in a lot in the West. Everything's an exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that that's a tendency, in Australia. But one of the good things, one of the positive things I think that's happening in Australia in terms of spirituality is that people are starting to look more at the traditional culture here, so meaning the Aboriginals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only I would say it's only slowly starting to grow. But my hope would be that in the future that would be taught in education. I know when I grew up, and it was probably like this for you guys in America as well. I just learned about Britain. I learned about Captain Cook landing on Australia and
Right.
and all of these things where we never heard anything about Aboriginals, even though I had a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander friends. So and even they didn't know about it. So I think that's one of the positive things here.
Fascinating. Jason, your book, Fasting the Mind, the subtitle is Spiritual Exercises for Psychic Detox. Tell us about that. Talk to us about that.
Well, in my book, Fasting the Mind, I go into an older practice of fasting the mind. This is, I guess, well known through Vipassana and open awareness meditation and Zen. But I try to incorporate this into a sort of like a lifestyle philosophy for people that they can kind of try and live by to keep that center of balance. So the spiritual exercises for psychic detox is basically, a system I outlay. It's a lifestyle system where you focus on the fundamentals of meditation, prioritizing sleep, which is, not important these days for some reason, exercise and having a healthy diet and focusing on nutrition. And, this comes back, that sort of system goes back to, yogic philosophy of the 8 limbs of yoga, and also Vedanta and using Ayurveda as well, focusing on these things where we have a complete lifestyle approach to holistic living. So, if we are out of balance with one, so for example, if we're not getting enough sleep, our mind just can't, cope with the everyday life. You can't walk around tired. You're going to be very frustrated and a very agitated person to be around. So, I explain a lifestyle philosophy to follow fasting the mind. So that would be kind of the spiritual exercises aspect that I look in at the book. And, for example, if we look at sleep and prioritizing sleep, I have a focus. There's a subchapter in the book called Digital Detox, where I talk about the importance of getting away from digital devices, especially at nighttime, because the effect that the blue light in digital has on our pineal gland. Because when we look at the research, our pineal gland secretes melatonin naturally hours before bed because it's preparing us for bed. So it naturally does that, and that makes you less alert and makes you more conducive for sleep. But if we're looking at staring at our phone, clutching at our phone in bed, getting that last tweet off, a lot of people complain that they're struggling from insomnia and that, and it's because you're staring in that blue light. That's one reason, but it's one core reason. So I speak about that as a sort of a style of practice that we can implement, where you say at 5 or 6 o'clock, you say shut down complete, and you have what I call it as a digital sunset. So you speak to your husband or wife or whoever at night. You live real life, instead of the digital life that we've become so accustomed to. So, and this has, sorry, Phil, this has like bigger implications as well on your all-around well-being.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, the term mind fasting, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, mind fasting means similar to how we think about bodily fasting, where we take out. So with body fasting, we don't consume anything. With mind fasting, the ancient practice is that you don't consume anything through the eyes and the ears, meaning you are starving your mind of distractions and stimulation. This can also go to the food that we eat as well. So, if you're eating a lot of ice cream and drinking alcohol and eating all sorts of things like that, it's going to agitate your mind, and that's not going to be good for fasting the mind. So you have to focus also on a good, clean diet. But when I say mind fasting, I'm really focusing on the things that we consume mainly through our eyes and ears, because that agitates the sixth sense, which is the thoughts within our mind, or in the East they say just the mind in general is a sixth sense. So once we consume too much through our senses, through our eyes and ears, all of us know that our mind can be agitated from that. So we're in a society now where mind fasting itself is very important to practice, because we have, especially young people, who are looking at the internet day in and day out and are consuming information without realizing that, if you're constantly consuming information, you're not allowing any time for assimilation. So you are just agitating your mind. You're like eating ice. It's like eating ice cream constantly. That's your diet, so you're very high in glucose, but this is more so the glucose of the mind, so it's that's what I mean by mind fasting. So mind fasting is basically a practice to take all of those distractions out and to structure your life, or even to have periods each year where you go away and you just completely switch off from everything in the world and allow your nervous system to come back down to its natural equilibrium, and bring your mind back into equanimity. And this allows you to, when you go back into the world, to be much more productive and effective, as opposed to just being agitated 24 hours a day.
Mm-hmm. Jason, I'm curious, if somebody comes to you, perhaps they've read one of your books, perhaps they've read something that's triggered them, or spoken to somebody that's triggered them, so that they want to bring more spirituality into their lives. What do you tell them to do?
Well, it's kind of a
let me go. You're sitting on a plane next to somebody. You kind of tell them a little bit about what you're into and what you do, and I think, God, where do I start? Where do I go? Mm-hmm. What would you tell them?
I would tell them to start taking the distractions out of their life. I know that sounds too obvious, and probably something that a lot of teachers or people in general who are into spirituality don't think about, because most people would wax lyrical and say, just be silent and watch the mind, and I say that, yeah, that's great, that's all useful as well, but a lot of people don't really know how to, if they're not familiar with spirituality, they don't know how to really be silent within, or to watch the mind. So I'll give them the practical tool of just saying, look, eliminate distractions, reduce your time on social media, reduce your time on television, try and incorporate a meditative practice daily, preferably stillness meditation, because a lot of people are usually scared to look at their own mind. That's why they take up, they'll take up physical spiritual exercises, but they will try to ignore, ones that are involved in self-inquiry or mindfulness. So I would say that first and foremost is to take out the distractions, incorporate a daily meditation practice, and to go from there, like to see how you feel after a month or two or 6 months. And, even I would say to them, come back to me and report to me and tell me how you feel. And if you don't feel great, fair enough, go your own way, do your thing, but I know with everybody that I've encountered, I know with myself personally, I've never heard, the mind is, we all have the same mind, and the mind is the same. I should say the mind functions in the same way. When we agitate it, it's hard for the mind to stop, ruminating on itself, so when we take away a lot of the distractions that we usually consume, it naturally comes down back to its equanimous state, where then we can start to work with deeper issues that we have within ourselves. That's what people will get attracted to when they further their practice along, is dealing with those deeper issues. But once they have to get to that stage first,
Right.
So yeah. And this comes back to also what we were talking about, like when we were talking about earlier, where people can just focus on, they just focus on their practice and they forget that they're a human deep down. This comes back to stinking up Zen. So, if you don't take your practice further, then you won't get to that place where you've got to actually work on those deeper things that we have to all work on.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, when we asked about the influences on your path, you mentioned very important people, all of whom are dead. Did you, in your journey, have a guru or any particular living teacher that you study to or feel some dedication to or loyalty to? Question one. Question two,
Yeah.
when you have students, presumably over a long period of time, do you get treated as if you were a guru?
Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, Phil. First one, to answer the first one, I would say there was two living gurus that were influential on my path. First one was, as I mentioned earlier, was Muji.
Mm-hmm.
I encountered him in my 20s, and I have a sense of, these days I have not, I've stayed away from the Sangha for my own personal reasons. I don't want to really get into that, but I feel that back in the around 2008 and that, when I was first introduced to him, it was when he was going to Tiruvannamalai and places like that. It was really pure, and I was really inspired. And I do have a sense of loyalty to Muji. I still watch him a lot, and I make an effort to go and see him every now and again. And the second one was Sadhguru. I don't know if you know Sadhguru. Jaggi Vasu.
Yes, I do.
Oh, yeah.
He's been on our show.
Yes.
Yeah. I love Sadhguru. Why I like Sadhguru is he kind of incorporates what we were talking about before, not to stink of
Yes,
Zen.
exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
You're right. I've spent time with him. You're right.
Yeah, he has a really fun human element about him, and I don't think he takes himself too serious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what I admire about him the most is he's really promoting the benefits of the Vedic culture in India still to today, where a lot of people in India, the modern intellectuals in India, are stepping away from the Vedic culture and are gravitating more towards atheism and rationality. And I think that they're missing out. All of us three know that they're definitely missing out on the beauty of what India is and that ancient culture that's still there today. And that's why I like to go to the rural places actually in India, because they still have that thriving. But yeah, Sadhguru would be the other one. I would say that where I am now, I listen to Sadhguru more than and see Sadhguru more than Muji, but I still have a lot of respect for both of them. And to answer your second question, Phil, I have had people come up to me and treat me that way. I've had it's interesting. I've probably had more, I don't know why this is, but more females treat me that way than men. Maybe I don't know. Maybe because men are more cynical. But but I've had a couple of both men and women who have strongly referred to me as, an enlightened teacher and all of this sort of things, which I've instantly shot down because I don't feel that way. And I try to, correct them and say that I'm just as you are, living this life, trying to do the best I can and understand myself and this universe the best I can as well. So, I try to, especially in the lectures and the tours and all of that and the retreats that I hold, I try to keep the focus that we're all learning together on this path. And, just because I've wrote a few books and this and that doesn't make me any better than anybody else. It might say that I've probably thought about these things a lot more than they have. And this is my life, I'm not going to lie to you. Like every day, this is the way I live. So, so maybe that's just the respect that they showed towards me. But maybe it's the, I don't know if it's the innocence in me or not, but I don't act or I don't respond too well to a lot of adulation,
Mhm.
So.
Well, you won't get it from us.
Yeah, no, never here. Jason, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and remind our listeners the book, Fasting the Mind, Spiritual Exercises for Psychic Detox. Any final words you'd like to share with our listeners?
Just if anyone's interested in finding anything about my work and what I do, to go to jasongregory.org and please check out my new book, Fasting the Mind. And, a parting message, I don't really have one because usually I come up with something that's too much of a cliche. So I just say, keep focusing on oneself and bettering yourself to help the world and better others. That's I think what the most that all of us can do is, once we better ourselves, we better the world. So that's all I'd like to say.
Great point. Thank you so very much.
Thank you,
both.
Jason,
It was a
for
pleasure
being with us. And if you get to the States, please let us know.
Definitely will. Thank you,
Okay.
Phil and
All
Dennis.
the best.